So I thought what we would do is, because they were so specific in the last panel, that we would sort of broaden the lens out a little bit and look at the threat that ISIS presents, how that threat is different from the Al-Qaeda threat. And let me just introduce briefly our panel. On the far end is John Carlin, who's the Assistant Attorney General for National Security. He previously served as Chief of Staff and Senior Counsel to FBI Director Robert Mueller. We have David Scaria. How did I do? Did right. Okay, he's a legal coordinator for the UN Security Council's Counterterrorism Executive Director, and he can give us a really good international view of how the picture for counterterrorism is changing, and particularly the legal picture and the way that's changing. Before he served as the lead, he served in the UN, he was the lead counsel in major counterterrorism cases before the Supreme Court of Israel. We have Rebecca Weiner, a good friend of mine. We've been coming to these conferences for years, and she's the director of the intelligence analysis for the NYPD, advising the Deputy Commissioner for Intelligence. And last but not least, Ali Soufan, who's the CEO of the Soufan Group and a member of the Homeland Security Advisory Council. And his 2011 book, Black Banners, which I reviewed for the Washington Post and thought was fabulous. I suggest, if you really want to understand what's going on with Al-Qaeda and the timeline of what has gone and how it's developed, it's a terrific book, and we have Ali here too. So if we could welcome our panel, that would be great. So I wanted to start with a little bit of a general question for all of you, and that is that there's been a lot of sturm and dram about ISIS, and a rush, and I would say maybe by some in the media, to look at the Islamic State through the same lens as the Al-Qaeda group. Do you think that's led us, John, to overstate the problem that ISIS presents to the United States and the homeland? I think it's just on.
Looks good. Well, thank you, Dina. Thank you for the introduction and for having me here today. So at the Department of Justice, the National Security Division was stood up post 9/11 to focus on national security threats. It's the first new litigating division of the Department of Justice in 50 years. And in our DNA is the desire to make sure that intelligence, whether it's gathered inside the U.S. or abroad, is shared with those in law enforcement so they can combat emerging threats and stop attacks before they occur. And in that sense, to your question, Dina, as we look at ISIL and as the threat develops, there's been a change over time. And I think at the beginning of the conflict in Syria, there was a different demographic, and the intention of folks who were attempting to travel to that region was one that with mixed motivation. Some might be going to join up with terrorist groups. Some might be going up motivated by anti-Assad rather than a foreign terrorist fighter agenda. Some might be going over for humanitarian or other reasons. And what we're seeing over time is a shift, particularly after the well-publicized brutal beheading by ISIS and the subsequent response by the United States. The demographics of the group, the individuals that we see now inside the U.S. who want to go to that region tend to be younger, and they're individuals who know what the group is about and are going because they want to join with a foreign terrorist organization.
Do they think that the group is about a Muslim utopia, or do they think the group is about killing people?
So the group is about killing people, and one of the challenges, and it's not just a challenge in the United States, if we look at the current numbers now, over 16,000 foreign fighters are already in the region. That's up the numbers we were putting out just shortly ago. That said it was over
These
15.
are new numbers that you're providing
numbers
that are coming out later today.
That's correct.
Okay.
So the new numbers are over 16,000 foreign fighters in the region. There are over 2,700 of those fighters are Westerners. Over 100 roughly of U.S. persons have either traveled or attempted to travel over to that region. And the number of countries that have sent foreign terrorist fighters into that region was 80, and now it's over 90 countries have joined up in that conflict. And one thing we have to do as we combat ISIL is this is a group, along with other groups, that are taking advantage of a new trend in technology, that are using the internet and social media to put out slick propaganda campaigns of a slickness that really we haven't seen before in the community, and particularly taking advantage of social media. And so they, to some, they are marketing themselves as what they are, which is a group that is about death and destruction, is ultimately nihilist. But to others, they do use glossy marketing type techniques to appeal, particularly to younger individuals, that somehow when they get over there, it's going to be more of that type of utopia. And so it's incredibly important, I think, both to reach out to communities. In over 80% of these cases where we've seen foreign terrorist fighters, according to one study, there's been someone in the community in a position to intervene, and in a majority of cases, they did not intervene until after the person ended up in the law enforcement system. So you need community support. And secondly, it's over 90 countries. As you can see from the numbers, the U.S. role is much smaller even than our Western partners, and we want to keep it that way. But it also means ultimately to stop this threat, we need to work with foreign partners. I think we saw incredible steps along those lines when the president was here in September, and you saw the unprecedented unanimous Security Council resolution calling on nations around the world to combat this foreign terrorist fighter threat, both through their legal systems, through combating violent extremism, and denying these groups funding. And on the tail of that, we also participated in a group called the Global Countering Terrorist Forum of over 29 countries who are working to develop best practices and share those practices so there are laws on the books that stop people from going over and fighting with foreign terrorist organizations.
Okay, we'll do a little bit more on international in a second, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you, is there an updated number in the number of Americans who have joined ISIS?
It's the same number that we put out before, which is over 100 have attempted to go over, gone over and come back. And I'll put a cautionary note out with that, which is we don't know what we don't know, and that's always what concerns and worries us the most. But that number includes folks who were there before that shift in demographic, who really may not have been over there to join a foreign terrorist group and do not pose the same type of threat as an individual choosing to travel there today would.
The number that's been kicked around about the number of Americans who are with ISIS is about a dozen. Is that a number that we should feel comfortable with?
I've seen that number, and I think Director Comey had stated that they believe there were about a dozen who are overseas currently fighting with or associated with ISIL. And he also emphasized we don't know what we don't know, and that needs to continue to be the priority of the intelligence community.
So, Ali, let me just turn to you quickly, and let's talk about the difference between Islamic State, ISIL, and ISIS, because we were talking about this outside. I know as a radio reporter, I end up having to put all three names somehow artfully into my pieces, because at the White House, they always say ISIL, and any analyst or lawyer always says ISIS, and the Islamic State, the so-called Islamic State, calls itself the Islamic State. So can you just lay this controversy bare and tell us what we ought to be saying?
Well, it's the same organization, and I'm going to call them the Islamic State or IS. The reason is we call them ISIS or ISIL because they said our name now is not the Islamic State in Iraq. Our name is the Islamic State in Iraq and Sham or the Levant. So that's why we call them ISIS or ISIL. Well, they changed their name now. They call themselves the Islamic State. So I think, I'm going to call them the Islamic State. Because tomorrow when they attack some place in Saudi Arabia, we'll be like, wait a second, you're violating the rules. You're only in the Levant. You shouldn't go to the Arabian Peninsula. So I think, I call them whatever they call themselves. That does not mean that I recognize them as a state, nor I think of them as Islamic in any way, shape, or form. They are thugs and murderers. So that's it.
So I still have to use all three. That's what it sounds like.
No, use one, IS.
Okay, David, let me turn to you. And we touched very briefly on stemming the tide of foreign fighters internationally and how people have to work together. The U.S., for a long time, ever since I've been doing terrorism, has gotten a lot of grief about its material support statute. Basically, if you do so much as buy a plane ticket to join a terrorist group, that is enough to have you fall under that statute and be arrested and tried. And this is the statute under which most of the people who have traveled to Syria who have been caught, I think I'm right about this, John, they've mostly been prosecuted or charged with material support. Is that right? So let's talk about the international version of this. Ever since the Ottawa killings, suddenly Canada is looking at material support and thinking that isn't such a bad idea. What's the international view of this? And talk a little bit about how the UN is weighing in as well.
Okay. Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I would start a bit more generally with the question that you posed, and I think it's how we should look at it when we leave the U.S. borders. The question whether the threat is overstated to the U.S. national security has to be, in my view, divided into two separate questions, whether the threat is overstated and where it is overstated vis-a-vis the US. And the entry point of the UN, and I think the entry point in many countries, is to look at ISIL or ISIS or the Islamic State, whatever we call them, as a global issue, as something that transcends specific countries or specific regions. And we believe that this is the right way to approach it, and whether this is the right way also for the US, it makes a lot of sense to look at it not just as a threat directly from people coming back to the US and threatening the US national security, but how it will affect countries who either don't have the experience in dealing with foreign fighters, who don't have the expertise, or may not have even the resources to deal with it. John mentioned that important meeting that took a month ago under the Obama presidency of the UN Security Council, in which much of the differences between countries who, mainly the US, who look on issues of terrorism through the material support lens, and countries who do not like the material support offense, has been kind of bridged. And it was bridged through a landmark resolution of the UN Security Council. Actually, the architect of that resolution is over there, David Lee from US-UN, in which the Security Council adopted under Chapter 7, which means it's binding on all member states, a new set of requirements to criminalize every travel to foreign states in order to fight terrorism, in order to join a terrorist, but also much broader preparatory activities that facilitate this travel. So even though countries will probably, many countries, specifically in the European continent, will not adopt a basket offense such as the material support, when they will look at this resolution and will have to checkmark their laws against that resolution, they will say, we actually need to criminalize this, and that, and it will be probably very close to something like material support.
So criminalizing, for example, traveling to join ISIS.
Not just traveling, organizing, equipping, facilitating travel, anything, financing travel, anything that supports the phenomena of foreign fighters has to be criminalized by all member states, Canada, European, and other countries. It's not just a matter of technical differences. Some countries are, without naming anyone, are ambivalent about this. They have their own national interests that not necessarily play the same way. And the fact that there is now a universal regime helps all of us in better dealing with the challenge.
Okay, so let's go from the global to the local. Rebecca, I'm sorry, I saved you for last. Let's talk a little bit about what's going on in New York, if we can. I mean, it's been said publicly that there have been tens of people who have traveled from New York to Syria. How do you know who's dangerous?
I think that's the question that the intelligence community and law enforcement as a whole are grappling with. It's very tricky, as we've heard this morning. Thank you. As we've heard a lot this morning, thinking about the threat is complicated, and there's many facets of the threat, right? And the situation is very fluid in Syria and Iraq There are many wars that are being fought there. There are many groups that are there. ISIS has taken up the lion's share of press headlines, but there's over 1,000 groups that are operating. So how do you know who's dangerous? It's very, very difficult to know, especially ex ante, before people are going. So I think we have to think about what is the threat to New York City, which is very similar to what is the threat to, the United States as a whole. And you can categorize it in a number of different ways, and we've seen various manifestations of those categories. So there are those who leave from the U.S. and want to engage in an act of violence overseas. We've seen that. We've seen suicide bombers who are American fighting alongside Jabhat al-Nusra. We've seen individuals fighting with ISIS who've been killed. We've seen opportunistic returnees. Somebody this morning, I think it was Matt Olson, referenced Mehdi Nemmouche, an individual who killed 4 people in a Jewish museum in Brussels in the name of ISIS. He'd spent a year overseas and returned and carried out this attack. We've seen would-be travelers who were thwarted for one reason or another, who wanted to travel and couldn't, who carried out an attack locally. And that's something that has us particularly vigilant right now. We saw 3 incidents 2 weeks ago, 2 in Canada and 1 here in New York City. 4 police officers were attacked by a man with a hatchet. We've seen similar and overlapping to that category. Individuals who are inspired by ISIS's propaganda, and we've spoken a lot about that this morning, how slickly packaged it is, how compelling, and we were, I think, particularly chagrined on September 21st when ISIS spokesman Mohammed al-Adnani changed his tune, as we sort of assumed he would eventually, and said, you know what, foreign fighters, don't just come here. If you really want to take part in this cause, you can do something locally, however you can, whenever you can, and that's something that we are particularly mindful of. And then those who come back from fighting and instead of engaging in an act of violence, establish a recruitment pipeline to encourage others. So we're seeing various manifestations of that. The one thing so far that we haven't seen is a very complex external operations plot that is directed returnees from a top-down perspective. That's something that we're worried about. How can we know which category somebody is going to fit into before they go? Very, very difficult. You can have a sense of what their intentions are and try to gather as much information as you can, but that's why I think law enforcement really is very mindful of everyone who's planning to go. Many people go for particularly, completely lawful reasons, and there's a resource and a legal challenge to looking at everyone who wants to go. But that's why it's such a confounding threat, I think.
Well, I also wonder, what's the difference between sort of a crazy who says that they're doing something for ISIS, I won't necessarily say the hatchet man was that, but versus someone who really is taking up the call. Maybe you can talk about this a little bit, Ali. Jihad Jane, going back a couple of years, was living in a trailer, taking care of her common-law husband's dying father, trolling the internet, and suddenly became Jihad Jane and decided that she wanted to go to Copenhagen and kill people. She just as easily could have found the bright, shiny object to be, it seems to me, white supremacy. So how do you fight that kind of threat?
Well, I think this is a very good question. And I think this is a problem that we never dealt with after 9/11. Our strategy has been based, actually we didn't have a strategy, we had a set of tactics to keep the homeland safe. And these tactics were very successful. We were able to disrupt a lot of plots, we were able to put a lot of people in custody, get the leaders, kill Osama bin Laden himself. However, if you look about 13 years after 9/11, there are more people today who believe in the ideology of Osama bin Laden in 2014 than we had in 2011. In 2011, the members of Al-Qaeda around Osama bin Laden were 400. Now you have thousands of people from the west shores of Africa to Southeast Asia. The ideology is the problem. And I think we have such a confusion in the West when we talk about the ideology because we're scared to talk about faith and about Islam. I don't think the ideology has anything to do with Islam personally. I think the ideology is bin Ladenism. It's an ideology that was executed in the 1996 Declaration of Jihad that Osama bin Laden signed Khorasan, by the way, back in 1996, in August 23rd. It's an ideology that resulted in the fatwa of 1998 to kill Americans and plunder their money. It's an ideology that was communicated with Osama bin Laden through John Miller when he interviewed him, and through Peter Bergen when they interviewed him in 1997 and 1998. And it is an ideology that Al-Qaeda shifted after 9/11, after we destroyed their center of gravity in Afghanistan. They shifted it from being a chief operator to being a chief motivator. So they start promoting the ideology, they start promoting the ideas of Osama bin Laden, and they depended on affiliates around to operate under Al-Qaeda's wagon. That's something we never seen when bin Laden was in charge. Some of these affiliates are more Qaeda than others. AQAP is still the same as Al-Qaeda. Actually, AQAP is the main connector between the affiliates and between the leadership in Khorasan. Syria gave an opportunity for Al-Qaeda to go back into the realm of operation. So they sent people who are veterans from Al-Qaeda, we call them now Khorasan for the lack of a better term, to help Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria establish itself as an official affiliate. They also have a great opportunity in Syria to find recruits who can travel to all over the place, to give new blood to the global jihadi movement, and also at the same time to get a lot of equipment and material that is very hard for them to get anywhere else. So now we see that the ideology actually was moving all these things, not vice versa. So today, for example, most of the members of ISIS, more than half of the organizations, are people who are foreign fighters, people who are motivated to go and join because of the same thing that motivated somebody like the individuals you were talking about. People who went on the internet, people who were very interested to see what's going on and watch videos. But also at the same time, these guys don't just buy a ticket and go. There is a network. There is a person that they will talk to in their city, in their neighborhood, an individual that can facilitate the travel, individuals that wait for them when they arrive to Turkey and get them into Syria or some other places. So there is a network that David was talking about, and that's why the solution is an international solution, not only a local solution. So if you look at all these terrorists, the numbers are really scary. I mean, you have 16,000 foreign fighters from 90-some different countries. But let's look at the statistics. More than 60% of them, they come actually from only 5 countries around the world. The number one, do you know who? The number one nationality in ISIS? Tunisians. Number 2 is Saudis. Number 3 is Moroccans, Jordanians, and Turks. So basically, if you look at the organization, more than 60% of the members are not from the West, are not even from Syria, are not from Iraq. So that gives us an idea where to start and how to map the threat and what's causing these individuals to go. In the West, there's different reasons. People go for different, some people are motivated by adventure, some people are motivated by the lack of opportunities, some people basically are motivated by this ideology that is being fed through streams of ignorance and economic, the uneconomic development and, tribalism, sectarianism, all these issues. I mean, you have an education system in the Near East that suffocates critical thinking. You have political corruption, women's rights, forget about it. Women have no meaningful contribution to their societies whatsoever. Political corruption. And then take all these things, you also have regional powers who are competing against each other for dominance in the region. So they are using Islamic extremism, they are using this form of terrorism as a proxy against each other. So the situation is not, unfortunately, as simple. I think you're looking at a 3-dimensional system here. You have the ideology that's creating this issue locally, and it can be motivated, it can be fueled either by sectarianism or tribalism. It depends how you look at it. You have a regional conflict, and also you have an international system that is not adequately prepared to deal with this issue. So I think that's why, you know, you need to work on these three different levels, and that's why intelligence, law enforcement, but also at the same time diplomacy is extremely important in creating an appropriate coalition that can actually handle that stress.
So one of the things that makes, I think, ISIS in this particular problem in Syria different is that it's actually quite easy to get to Syria. Yemen, a lot of people stopped going there because they would get caught before they would get there. Somalia, same problem. When the Minneapolis Somalis were going to Somalia, a lot of them were being intercepted because there weren't a lot of different ways to get to Somalia. You went to Kenya and you sort of moved over. Whereas in the case of Syria, you make a left at Turkey and you're where you need to be. And you can drive.
You're not looking at me.
No, not yet. So, and for example, there was a German that was working for ISIS and he got injured and he couldn't fight, so they actually sent him back to Germany on a shopping trip because it was so easy for him to load all this stuff in his car and theoretically bring it back to ISIS, ISIL, or the Islamic State. So talk to me a little bit about this diplomatic piece that Ali was talking about, given this context that, in fact, it is so easy, really, if you're motivated to get there.
I would start with adding, I think Ali covered almost all of it, and I know that there is one point that he didn't cover, and not because he doesn't think it's a very important one, and that is, aside from the law enforcement, diplomatic effort, and international cooperation, it's the role of CVE, the role of countering violent extremism, and I know that this is an issue that Ali and his group are deeply involved. It's a tough question, and it's a tough question to first, because I don't want to start naming countries and looking at who's doing its job and who could be better doing his job. The issue is that one of the biggest differences with ISIL than past conflicts where foreign fighters came from all parts of the world is that it's in the heart of the Middle East. It's in the juncture of Europe, Asia, and Africa, and there is no real way to lock ISIS and the region and say nobody comes in, nobody comes out. There will always be ways to come in and ways to get out of it. Does it mean that there should not be more willingness and pressure and technical knowledge on how to better prevent people from going there? Yes, there should be all of this, and much of it is happening within the UN. I think the resolution that was mentioned here clearly sets the norms, and very clearly, and I said in a binding way. And it is also true that bilaterally, the US, and again, I'm not representing here the US, is working with its partners and allies to make sure that any loopholes that are available that makes this cross-border transfer very easy would not be continued to be so. All in all, it's something that has to be looked as more than just solving or closing the loops. The problem of FTFs, and this is something that may have not been touched on so far, is not just the problem of today. It is likely to stay with us in at least the next decade and even beyond, because at some point these people, whether we like it or not, will go back to their countries. And when we're talking about more than 80 countries that contribute fighters to the Islamic State, at some point the people will go back and some of them will try to use the networks that they have today, the trust they have built among fighters, the operational links, to create new dangers in new parts of the world that they will find vulnerable enough to pose a new threat. It's not going to be probably the main theater will not probably be the US. It will be those small and middle-sized countries that do not have, as I said, the experience, expertise, or the resources to be dealing with. And if a country like Tunisia has, as we know, more than 3,000 people there, some of them will probably go back there at some point.
John, is the Department of Justice doing things with other countries to try and help them along in developing these sorts of things? Can you give us some idea of the discussions that are going on?
Yes, so even prior to the current attention, there was one group in particular, the Global Counterterrorist Forum, that worked together to try to develop best practices. What would statutes look like on the books if you're trying to combat the terrorist problem while protecting human rights and civil liberties? And so several years ago, folks from the Department of Justice, working with state and the other countries as part of that initiative, created something called the Rabat Memorandum that codified, here's what the best practices would look like. And then that was used as people went back to their home countries to see what type of statutes that they could develop. Building upon that, linked to the United Nations event, the Global Counterterrorist Forum met again, that's that group of 29 countries, and adopted another memorandum of best practices, specifically identifying the foreign terrorist fighter as a threat and working to build statutes on their books that would allow you to use the criminal justice system as a tool to prevent the individual from traveling or facilitating the foreign terrorist fighter organization overseas. And that's critical long-term to stopping the STEM. As everyone, I think, has said today, it is a worldwide problem, and a strategic response means building capacity not just here, but with our partner nations, and not just the Western countries, because the vast majority aren't coming from there, but partners with countries all over the world. And that's, again, where I point to that Security Council resolution, where it's really a sign that there is a worldwide, from countries that don't agree on much, ISIL in some ways has provided a strategic opportunity, because the countries do agree that the foreign terrorist fighter, which has now been defined for the first time at the United Nations, is a problem that affects everyone, every regime, every people, and it's going to take a combined global response to stop. More specifically, in our division, we also send, at request, prosecutors over to meet with their counterparts in particular countries that are wrestling with some of the problems we've wrestled with here, and we walk through how we've handled issues like introducing sensitive sources and methods in the criminal justice system, how the material support statute works, and as the Attorney General mentioned prominently in a trip to Europe over the summer, the use of undercover operations as a way to ensure that the person, which is very important obviously in the United States system, with our strong protection for freedom of speech in the First Amendment, that this isn't someone who's talking the talk, but it's someone who's going to walk the walk to see whether they take concrete steps to meet their foreign terrorist goals.
So let me shift the conversation just a little bit and talk a little bit about social media and how that's playing a role in the Islamic State. Now, I've been watching this for a long time, and it used to be that all you saw on the internet was videos about atrocities that were supposed to radicalize people and maybe have a recruiter that was, for example, in Lackawanna, who took someone to the camps and tried to keep them there and tried to indoctrinate them during 6 weeks or several months. Now, it's almost like dating, online dating. You know, not that I know anything about that, but we used to need personal contact, and this new generation that's coming up, 18 to 30-year-olds, don't need the personal contact to be quite as enthused as they used to be. That there's a great dialogue that goes on online that actually energizes them in the same way a person used to. And at the same time, social media really helps law enforcement because remember, you used to have to go into chat rooms with fake names and try to find people who were typing things that might signal that they're doing something untoward. But now their pictures are out there. Their iPhone photos are showing them with the guns in fighting for the Islamic State, and that's changed the game. So I wonder, and I don't know, maybe Rebecca, you can start. how do you combat something like that? It's you no longer, as a law enforcement official, need to find the recruiter. You just have social media.
Yeah, no, I think that's something that has been pretty remarkable to watch the evolution, particularly with ISIS in their propaganda strategy. And one of the key elements of it is its decentralization and their use of social media platforms to get the message out. And so they, I think, have optimized their messaging in a way that I think Madison Avenue would take some lessons from them. More probably formidable in many ways in terms of their production than their battlefield successes. So we've seen very slick videography put out by ISIS, and this isn't sort of what you're seeing in terms of fear-mongering on CNN or Fox News and beheading videos and crucifixions and mass killings, which are meant to instill fear in us, but rather in the willing consumers of the propaganda, the opposite messages about valor and family values.
And
Interesting.
kitty cats. For some reason, they're
kitty
cats in a lot of the videos.
Yes.
And happy children with
babies.
toys, in the perfect Muslim utopia.
Right. So bring your family here. It's great. Pictures are, a man with an AK-47 in one hand and a toddler in the other hand, and saying, this is really the place for you to bring your children. It's wonderful here. I've had 5 children since I've been here, and it's great. Yeah. And then on the other hand, and I think this is telling, individuals, foreign fighters who are sending in their Twitter feed pictures of their children holding the severed heads of fighters. So social media allows us to see the true complexity of what's going on in all of its horrors and all of its, I think, sophistication. It also gives us a pretty effective lens into some of the people who are operating there. What do you do about it? It's difficult. You can't combat that message. Law enforcement certainly can't. We can't do it from a, turning off the lights perspective. We can't do it from a counter-messaging perspective. And I think that's where we really rely on the communities who are involved and whose children are going overseas to do some very effective counter-messaging, because there's nothing that we can do to stop the flow of the propaganda, unfortunately. It is only about occupying the field with other messages that are more salubrious, and I think we haven't seen enough of that yet.
Do you get the sense that the community, from a New York perspective, wants to help you in this fight, that they're worried that their kids are going?
Yeah, and I think, it's important to remember it's communities, right? It's an incredibly diverse threat. It's an incredibly diverse group of individuals who are going overseas, as we've mentioned. I think everyone understands that this is a big problem. Nobody wants their kid to be following this route. And so I think everyone together can think that it's a problem. I think the next step is to say, okay, how can we collectively design some effective solutions? And we're seeing that in fits and starts, at least proposed in Europe, and hopefully that same kind of strategy will happen here as well.
So Ali, why don't we talk a little bit about CVE, combating violent extremism, and how that works and whether it can work. And in some ways, we've been talking about violent extremism. The White House was doing stuff with Quentin Wictorowicz years ago about this. They were doing it in the UK. And it only seems to have suddenly become very fashionable to talk about it since the Islamic State really came on board. Can you talk a little bit about its evolution and where you think it's going and whether it will help?
I think, David mentioned something about it. Counter-violent extremism is an essential part, and I think even before the Islamic State came to be, people around the world realized that there is a problem. There is a problem with violent extremism in their own countries, and many countries came together and they composed the Global Counterterrorism Forum that been discussed. And you have Muslim countries and you have non-Muslim countries. The problem with counter-violent extremism and some of the difficulties that we've been facing, and we do a lot of research into that. We went around the world from Southeast Asia to Africa to Europe to the United States. There is no cookie-cutter approach, because what works in Tripoli, Libya, does not work in Sana'a, Yemen, and what works in Sana'a, Yemen, doesn't work in Aden, Yemen. There is different incubating factors that feeds into this. So basically, everything is local, and you have to go to the local level. And that's why we can assist, we can help people develop a counter narrative in their own communities. However, the situation is going to be very difficult if you don't have people standing up against the extremists and standing up against the recruiters in the different countries. Some countries were able to do it, build a very strong relationship with the community. Their laws are very different. Like, for example, Singapore have an excellent program, but the Singaporean program can never work in the West or in the United States. There's a very close relationship between the intelligence, the law enforcement, and the community, but also they have something where if somebody is talking bad or want to do something, they can actually put them in detention, not necessarily in jail, but in detention. And that's something can never work, for example, in places like the United
They do
States.
that for chewing gum too, though, don't they, in Singapore?
They will do something else. But so this is basically one of the complications, that there is no cookie cutter approach, that what make people join a terrorist organization or become violent extremists in New York is very different than London, very different than Paris and so forth, very, very different than the Middle East. However, I think because of the good work of the JCTF, because of the good work of all these countries, and through also the UN now getting together, discussing all these things, sharing information, from a legal perspective, from law enforcement perspective, from intelligence perspective, I think we're on the right path. But you know what? Towards the end, the root of the problem is still the the hijacking of the religion, and that is something. You have community leaders in the West and other places standing up against it, but the roots of the problem is still coming from the Middle East, and unfortunately, you still have countries in the Middle East who says, you know what? These guys are terrorists when they operate within our borders, but if they go and do it somewhere else, we can actually even work with them. We can even support them. And the ideology is being permitted within the boundaries of these countries. And that's going to make it very difficult for scholars in New York or in Washington, or scholars in Paris, or even scholars in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, to stand up against the people who are actually promoting the ideas of extremism and of terrorism. So this is where counter-violent extremism come to the picture, how we can work with communities around the world, how we can work with countries around the world, and how can we help them develop a system to enhance the capabilities of these communities to stand up against extremists.
I mean, part of the problem, too, is that there is a foreign policy underpinning to this, not just an ideological one. That there's a perception of, for example, if you're a member of Al-Qaeda, of U.S. foreign policy. And if you're the Islamic State, they had sort of had a half-hearted threat to the United States. If you come to us, or if you attack us, we will attack you. Al-Qaeda's threat is, we will attack you. So are we making it worse by coming in and bombing ISIS? Are we bringing them, I'm not sure I believe this, but this is one school of thought, is are we making it worse by getting involved with the conflict, and are we sort of goading them to come and do something to us?
You know what, I think today we're sitting here in my memory of a young man who was murdered in 1994. And we hope that his memory will teach us how to learn from the past so it won't repeat itself. Anyone who thinks that ISIS is not going to be a threat to the West, to the United States, if anybody believes this here, I have a bridge to sell you in Brooklyn, and I'll give you a good deal on it. I mean, ISIS is Al-Qaeda. The only difference between ISIS and Al-Qaeda is ISIS believe they are bin Laden's Al-Qaeda, not Zawahiri's Al-Qaeda. It's an ego issue between Zawahiri and between Baghdadi. The ideology is the same. You go to ISIS websites, it's all pictures of Osama bin Laden. It is the same rhetoric. Now, ISIS believe, you know what? We're going to hold land, we're going to hold territory, and we're going to fight for it, and we're going to establish a khilafah. Al-Qaeda believe, let's do it and run. But the ideology, the concept, is basically identical, and it's the same. I think if you look at the organization of ISIS, and the reason they are very organized, and the reason they are strategic, and the reason they have good structures is because the leadership is not the Islamists. The leadership is not the foreign jihadis. All the Shura members of ISIS are former Baathists who used to be really high up in Saddam's army. We had a camp, a detention facility in South Iraq called Buka Camp. In Buka Camp, we get all the nationalists, we get all the Baathists, we get all the extremists, we get all the foreign jihadis, and we put them all together. And they met each other and said, hey, you know what? Let's work together. That's ISIS today. The number one guy is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Yes, you know, he's not known to be that exceptional leader. He doesn't have leadership skills that we know of. He studied Islam in Saddam's college, so you can imagine what kind of Islam he studied. And the number two person is Abu Muslim al-Turkmani, who used to be a high-level official in Saddam's army. Abu Ali al-Anbari, the number three, the same thing. So, you know, you have to look into what makes the organization. You have to look into the three factions that came together to create that threat. The tribes, basically Sunnis who have been oppressed by the new Maliki regime, that, you know, the new system in Iraq. Then you have the Baathists who have no other options but to fight. And then you have the jihadis that's coming from everywhere, you know, to fight under Al-Qaeda's flag. These three organizations makes ISIS. So in order to develop a strategy against ISIS, we have to know where it's coming from. We have to know the tribal affiliations it has, who's with it, who's not without it. The only way to defeat ISIS is not with airstrike. The only way to defeat ISIS is with creating a grassroots Sunni opposition to it in the same areas where they operate. If we don't do that, ISIS is going to continue to expand. And ISIS knows that. Yesterday, there is a tribe called the Bunimira tribe in Al-Anbar. They basically, so far, the numbers, there's different numbers, but some of the statistics tell us as high as 400 people from that tribe were murdered. Why? Because that tribe was one of the first tribes to work with the US and the Iraqi government as part of a Sahwa. So basically, they eliminated the whole tribe. Nobody is talking about it because we're focusing on some airstrike in freaking Kobani. You know, we're focusing on something that's happening on the Turkish border, and in the last week, ISIS controlled two of the largest gas fields in Syria. When we're focusing on something that has no strategic value. So in order to fight the enemy, we have to know the enemy. If you know your enemy and know yourself, you will win 100 times in 100 battles. I hope the people who are making the strategy know that code.
I don't want to get us too far off the subject, but given that you opened up this box, I've always wondered, if you have Baathists and you have these very, very devout Islamists, and the Baathists like to drink, and how are they staying together? And is this just a marriage of convenience until they're 2 miles outside of Baghdad, and then the Baathists within the ISIS group say, thanks for your help, we're done?
I don't think so. I think it created a new monster. And I think the Baathists are not going to be drinking in front of the extremists. Actually, the Baathists now have beards, and they have aliases, and they operate as if they are jihadis. But
is that a long-term thing?
Well, it's yet to be seen. It's yet to be seen.
Okay. So let me just quickly take some, thank you very much for this interesting discussion. I wanted to take some questions from the audience. If you could, wait until you get a microphone, and if you could introduce yourself, just so we know who's here, and make sure that there's a question in what you're saying. This young lady in the third row, please, with the pretty hair. Yes. You're welcome. I get to do that because I'm a woman. If I were a man, I wouldn't have gotten to say that.
And I loved your book. So.
Please stand up.
Hi, I'm Janet Reitman from Rolling Stone magazine, and I have a question just to follow what you were saying, Dina, on foreign policy. These young people who are being attracted to going to ISIS, they are attracted because of certain foreign policy decisions that the United States has made. And I was curious, Ali or anybody else on the panel, how are you thinking, or how are people thinking about combating that? It's a message. They're getting they're getting videos. They're getting pictures of dead children. They're getting a message from this group that, rightly or wrongly, that the United States is responsible for killing innocent civilians. Similarly, we put Baathists, foreign fighters, et cetera, in the same jail in Camp Bucca, and they were very angry at the United States. So I don't think you can, really say that our own foreign policy doesn't have a role in this. And I'm just personally curious and professionally curious about whether the United States is grappling on any level with our own responsibility, our political and foreign policy responsibility for some of this.
Look, for sure, there is some kind of foreign policy foundation or, backdrop on all the things that's happening. But they slit the throat of Jim Foley before we start bombing them. Okay, so let's keep everything in perspective. Also, at the same time, there are wars that has been going on for 1,400 years over there. Sunni, Shia, Turkmen, Arabs, Kurds. Saudis trying to find their influence in the Middle East versus Turkey versus Iran. So let's not put ourselves as the center of the universe and everything. Yes, we make mistakes, but I know what you mean. We make mistakes, but other people make bigger mistakes, and this is a problem that's rooted in the region, and sometimes we have to give them the opportunity to settle these wars and conflict that haven't been settled, have been on pause since the 1800s, since, during the Cold War, the whole conflict has been on pause. And now all the conflicts that took place between Persians and Turks and Arabs and Kurds and Turkmens and Shia and Sunnis are coming back. So we're trying to manage the situation over there. And I'm not saying that, our invasion in Iraq and stuff like that didn't have some to do with this, but the main problem in ISIS, the main problem in Syria, this is a problem that's rooted in the region. This is a problem that has to do with the sectarianism in the region, the ethnicity in the region. And I think it's a mess, and unfortunately, we're in the middle of it.
The gentleman in the back in the blue shirt, please.
So no compliment on my hair.
You have very nice hair.
Oh, thank you. I'm Stephen Calabria. I helped put together the morning brief. I was curious, two of the world's most prominent militant groups are ISIS and Boko Haram, but we never seem to hear about foreign fighters going to join Boko Haram. I was just curious what your thoughts were on that. Does it come down to race? Does it come down to effectiveness of propaganda? What are your thoughts?
Who wants to take that?
Without trying to be an expert, maybe Ali knows a better answer, but my guess is that I don't think Boko Haram came with a global campaign. And ISIS clearly came with a very effective global campaign. I could think of that as one reason. There could be many more, and it could be that I'm wrong because I really haven't studied. It's a very good question.
Boko Haram also started as a criminal group that was politically motivated within Nigeria, and most of its members are sort of offshoots of that. It's almost more gang-related. It started that way than Islamist-related. Do you have something else?
I think I go with I will add only one thing. Boko Haram, you remember what I said about there's no cookie-cutter approach. Boko Haram deals with incubating factors that's born from northern Nigeria. It is basically an ethnic group among specific ethnicities that believe that they lost a lot under the new Nigerian state. And if you look at northern Nigeria, 75% of the households have no electricity. Illiteracy rate is the highest in the world. 1 out of 7 children or 5 children have chronic malnutrition. I mean, there's a lot of problems.
Incredibly corrupt.
Incredible corruption. So these things created Boko Haram. A person who is in England or in New York or in Riyadh is not going to go and fight for issues that has to do with northern Nigeria itself. Syria is the Levant, is the center of the world. The situation is different.
This gentleman here in the red shirt in the front.
I'd like to ask the panel, what's their take on what happened in June in Iraq? That is an army that we had spent billions of dollars to train, thousands of dead and wounded to advise and get them up, collapsed in the space of, with all the reports we have, was hit security divisions are going to be rebuilt to fight this, but it raises serious questions about what we able to do on the ground there. And I also have heard estimates of ISIS being close to 100,000 troops, not 31,000 troops. So that's another question. What are we actually dealing with here?
Anybody want to take that?
I have to go.
Yeah. Thanks, Ali.
I have an exemption from this.
You have an exemption.
Yeah, I speak
Okay.
on behalf of the UN.
It's not really John's deal. I think I would just say that this is not unlike what you were just saying, Ali, that there were internal problems within Iraq, and I spent some time reporting for NPR in Iraq, and there were problems with the fact that people were no longer loyal to their leadership within these battalions. And that was partly because of what Maliki was doing. It was not completely blamed on training. I'm not an expert in this, but do you have anything to add?
I think, you know what, you basically point out something that we've been talking about for a while. You're 100% right. I mean, you know, you can't just give people weapons and think they're going to do the fight for you. And they need a reason to fight. And the areas that collapsed, by the way, were areas all controlled. It's actually Sunni tribal areas. So basically, they don't have the support of the population. They don't have the support of the, you know, of the host environment. And there's a lot of reasons why it collapsed, but towards the end, it collapsed. There is ethnic reasons, there's sectarian reasons, there's corruption issues, there's briberies, there is, you know, connections between Baathists and people who are still in the army. So the situation is complicated. However, I agree with you 100%. And I think this is one of the things that we have to understand, that we need to learn about what we're doing, about the areas where we are, about the ethnic divisions, the sectarian divisions, the local divisions, before we give weapons. Like in Syria now. You know, yesterday in Syria, we have two groups that we have been giving a lot of weapons for and a lot of training. Hazm and the Syrian rebel front led by a guy named Jamal Maroof. Both of them collapsed totally in Idlib, and all the weapons that, you know, the West gave now is in the hand of al-Nusra. And al-Nusra actually was sending a lot of people to join these groups, to be sleeper cells inside these groups, so when the war happens, they will join. So we have to understand these kind of things, and we have to know what we're doing and who we're helping and how we're not helping. And I think this is one of the complicated, add a different level of complications to the whole thing.
Steve Shapiro in front. This gentleman here, in the right tie.
Thank you, Dina. Steve Shapiro from Business Executives for National Security. A question for Mr. Carlin. The CVE discussion at the panel makes it quite clear that this is really a vexing issue. And I just want to note, as a predicate to my question, that when looking at the government's approach to this, you've looked at the National Security Council, for example, the office that dealt with CVE has been moved around several times so that its reporting requirements turn up in different departments. Either it's a direct report to the CT, now it's a direct and one step away from the president, now it's 2 steps away from the president, reporting to the Borders office. And in 2011, Q rolled out his the program that Dina made reference to earlier, and then just about 2 months back, Eric Holder, I think, repackaged that and rolled it out again. And I'm not being critical, but I am wondering, do you think that the government is properly organized to address this issue? And you know that I'm looking at the organizational issues on this. And then the bigger question is, do you think that this is a role at all for the federal government, or really is it something that must be undertaken at the very, very local level? Thank you.
We talked a little bit about earlier about the social media and what's the social media dimension. And I think the role that the internet and social media is playing in terms of the threat that is posed for terrorist acts to occur inside the United States or those of our allies and in places outside the region cannot be underestimated. And to use a kind of analogy that Director Comey had used in talking about the role of the internet and changing technology, the FBI was really founded in its first instant because of the advent of the highway and the automobile. And it created a new problem where our past laws in dealing with the threat were not sufficient, and it's partly why the FBI was created, to deal with this new problem of just interjurisdictional crime. Then you look at the next major transformation at the FBI, and it's post 9/11, and it has to do with another technological advancement. The boons for society are obviously huge, like they were for the automobile, and that's the airplane, which is taken and used against the United States to cause immense damage and a huge number of casualties here in New York. And now, as we look at how the threat is changing, we see this phenomenon of social media, and we see a group that's consistently committing mass slaughter of other Islamists and other Muslims on a daily basis that took a journalist and slowly severed his head on and broadcast that to the world, that in fact is selling women and children into sexual slavery as part of their tactics and strategy. And yet somehow this group is managing to use slick propaganda on social media to recruit and talk to people in the basements of the United States, of Canada, of the UK, of Australia, to convince them to become basement jihadis. And that poses a multitude of threats. One would be, we need to prevent the ungoverned spaces abroad so they can't do the complex type of operational attacks that they've done in the past. And we need to remember that lesson that we learned from al-Qaeda. But secondly, they're recruiting people to come over, fight, and then we're worried about what happens when they return, which we've talked about, like the situation in Brussels where someone spent a year with this group and then went back and shot up innocent civilians in a Jews museum. And the third is this problem of inspiring people who don't go anywhere. They just come out of the basement and choose to take violent acts against innocents here or in other countries. We are not the only country focused on this threat, and we're not the only country at risk. And that's why, again, I'll go back. If we're going to defeat this particular problem, it's going to take a coalition of partners across the world dealing with a similar phenomenon that is social media terrorists who use social media to reach into each of their individual countries to try to inspire people to commit heinous acts or get them to join abroad. And you saw that worldwide commitment in September at the United Nations. And its type of momentum, it's going to take time. It's not going to be done in days or weeks or months. It's going to take a fight and continued struggle over years. Let me circle back to combating violent extremism. So there's two particular floors where it needs to be combated. One is it takes voices outside the United States, particularly in the regions that are fueling this conflict. And what we, in terms of the U.S.'s role, need to do there is work with our partners so that those voices are heard. And I think and I'll defer to partners at State, including the Undersecretary of State, Richard Stengel, for the efforts that they're trying to do in that regard, to make sure that there are reasonable, credible voices, and there are, and there always will be, because the ideology that we're facing is fundamentally flawed. It's one of killing and death, slaughter, and sexual slavery. So this is a debate we ought to be able to win, but it means empowering those voices overseas to be heard. And then secondly, here inside the United States, I think it is a local community issue where we'll be most effective when we can get local communities engaged. And I go back to that study that said in over 80% of these cases, there was someone in a position to intervene before someone fell prey. And it's our children that they're targeting. Let's make no mistake about that. They're going for young demographics here who are vulnerable to the type of slickly packaged ideology that's masquerading the type of violence that they'll see when they get over there. We need local communities. In over 80% of those cases, there was someone who had the ability to intervene, and in a majority, they didn't. So that's the dynamic that we need to change here at home. And as the head of the National Security Division, I recognize I may not be the best person postured to do that. I'm certainly not the best person postured to be credible overseas as a scholar on Islam. And even inside the United States, my job is against terrorists and spies. And when we're talking about credible local community voices, it won't come from here. So it's to other parts of the government, I think we're looking, including U.S. attorneys' offices, but also social and community groups, to lead those combating violent extremist efforts. And I'd ask for those of you in the audience here, it's you as well, to go back and think about how is it that we can reach the very small population, but still a population that's vital to reach, to make sure they don't fall prey to this slickly packaged propaganda.
Great.
Great, and we're going to have to leave it there. I would just say that in the coming weeks, I think you're going to see the White House actually rolling out a rather large CVE program, and you will have learned a little bit about it today. Please join me in thanking the panel.